Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to give it another minute so we can get everyone in.
We hope your week has started off well. Thanks for giving up part of your evening to join us tonight. We're super excited.
We'll give everyone about 30 more seconds as we're getting everyone out of the waiting room. All right, let's get started. People will trickle in as we go. Hello, everyone. We are here with the Selective Mutism Association. My name is Meg, and I'm a parent of an amazing SM warrior. And I'm here today with Taylor and Brittany, who will introduce their awesome selves in a moment. Before we get started, we have a few announcements. On behalf of the Selective Mutism Association, we wanted to talk today about incorporating SM interventions within a multi-tiered system of support. This webinar was made possible thanks to a generous grant from the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available on our SMA YouTube channel soon. We will also send the link out to everyone who registered. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yep. Awesome.
Sorry. We will be recording this webinar and it will be available on the SMA YouTube channel. We are excited to work with you as the school year is underway, and you might have some questions on how to support your amazing students with selective mutism. Please use the Q&A box to jot down your questions, and we will have time at the end to answer. And one last note, we just wanted to put it on your radar. The Selective Mutism Association annual conference is coming up soon. Please register on our SMA webpage and join us Friday, October 6th and Saturday, October 7th for some incredible learning. Let me pass the baton to our amazing presenters, Taylor and Brittany, to introduce themselves.
Hi, all. I'll kick us off. My name is Taylor. I am a current board member of the Selective Mutism Association. And in my own work, so I am trained as a school psychologist. I'm an NCSP, and I've spent a number of years supporting students K through 12 as a school psychologist and then as a behavioral health consultant. But currently, I work in Michigan out of the Thriving Minds practice. I transitioned to clinical work. So I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Michigan, and I'm happy to be with you here today.
And hello, my name is Brittany Weiss-Urbach. I am also a board member of the Selective Mutism Association and trained school psychologist. Although I have been out of the schools for a few years now, it's near and dear to my heart, and a lot of the work that I do is closely related to working with schools around children with selective mutism. I work at the Child Development Center, which is part of Children's Wisconsin, and run all of the anxiety and selective mutism programming through the Child Development Center. So happy to be here today to talk about this very awesome topic.
Yes, wonderful. And Meg already did a great job of acknowledging and thanking the grant from the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation. Again, this and any of our other free webinars wouldn't have been possible without their donation. So our goals for today, we have an ambitious agenda. I'll give you a fair warning, so bear with us. We're going to try to cover a lot in our time together. We're hoping, of course, to dig into some specific interventions at Tier 2 and Tier 3 to support our students with selective mutism. We also want to cover various tools for progress monitoring, as well as take kind of a step back, larger picture, some bigger questions and considerations we want to take into account when supporting our students with SM in the school setting. So I'm going to start us off. Before we jump into those school-based interventions within the MTSS framework, I really just wanted to ground us in SM criteria, symptoms, and what that's going to look like in the school setting. So a bit of a refresher before we dig into our other content. So according to the DSM-5 criteria, remember that Selective mutism is that consistent failure to speak in specific social situations where there's that expectation for speaking, such as school, even though that student is very capable and comfortable in speaking in other situations or with other individuals. We know that there has to be a functional impact. The symptoms are significant enough where it's interfering with that student's educational, occupational, social performance and growth. And we're also looking at duration of symptoms. So we want to consider if the symptoms are going beyond a month and aren't limited to that first month of school where many of our students are adjusting. And finally, kind of some rule out criteria. We want to make sure that the failure to speak can't be solely attributed to a lack of knowledge or comfort with the spoken language. Although of note that for our multilingual students or our English language learners, they can have diagnoses of SM. We just have to do really good diagnostic work during those types of evaluations. And we also know that the symptoms can't be better or solely explained by a communication disorder or due to another diagnosis such as autism. Again, we can have a comorbid diagnosis of selective mutism and a speech and language difficulty as well as with autism. But again, that's going to take really great diagnostic work to sift through. So just like all of our students are unique in the school setting, their presentation of symptoms of selective mutism is likely going to be unique as well. So this slide does not portray all the symptoms you might see. It's just a sampling of some common ones that you want to be on the lookout for. So we know that if we have difficulty verbalizing with others, our classmates, our teachers, it's going to be really difficult for our educators to assess where students at academically, and then therefore difficult for them to provide really quality targeted instruction and corrective feedback to guide their learning. We know that it's likely going to impact student participation in a lot of the things we're expecting them to do throughout their day, such as participate in class discussions, group activities, presentations, and that their performance on a lot of tasks might fall below their true ability level. Socially, students with SM are at greater risk for difficulties in making and keeping friends. And if we're having trouble communicating with our peers comfortably, then just by default, we're going to lose important practice opportunities for some of those social skills, such as peer initiation, negotiation, problem solving, collaborative play. And we know that students with SM are sometimes treated younger or less capable by their peers. Peers trying to be super kind and helpful sometimes assume a caretaker or helpful role and start doing for or speaking for our students with SM. So we want to be on the lookout for that as well. We know behaviorally, they may be less likely to participate in extracurricular activities and have greater difficulty engaging in really important help-seeking behaviors, both in school and in the community. Now, if we fail to intervene or intervene effectively, we know that students with selective mutism are also at greater risk for negative long-term outcomes. They are likely then at higher risk to develop additional anxiety-based disorders or symptoms of depression. They're at greater risk for developing and demonstrating school refusal behaviors or poor school performance. And it can impact, the paths they carve out for themselves occupationally down the road as well. So this might look familiar to some of you. It's a common conceptualization used for the symptoms of SM, how they tend to occur and strengthen over time and become this really well-rehearsed avoidant behavioral pattern that our students with SM are practicing on a daily basis. And I want you to consider in the school setting how often students are asked to verbally engage with others. When they enter the school building and they're greeted by staff or peers, when they're asked what their lunch choice is, or if they have their homework to turn in, during group lessons, if they have any contributions or questions. So let's say a conservative estimate would be that a student has 25 times to verbally engage throughout their school day. That's 125 times a week. And in a 36-week school calendar year, that's 4,500 times. So if anyone practiced this cycle, I like to call it the avoidance cycle, they'd become quite good at it to the point of it becoming pretty automatic or second nature. That's why we don't want our students practicing that within the school setting. That's why we need to intervene really early and effectively, however we're able to. We want to partner with our students with SM, support them, and encourage them to grow their skills so they can establish a new behavioral pattern, which is the second multicolored cycle here on your screen. And I like to call this the cycle of approach, or the BRAVE cycle, where we're helping create a new behavioral script for themselves, where we know they might still encounter fear situations and experience some of that anxiety, but we want to equip them with new, different, stronger tools to help them gradually take steps towards growing their brave voice in the school setting, and also having all of their support staff and team coach them, encourage them, and support them differently. So thinking about then all the different ways we can support our students, I like to think of school-based supports kind of falling in 3 primary buckets. So we know that we have school-based interventions kind of situated within our MTSS framework. And then we have more formal kind of paths of support, such as our 504 accommodation plans or our IEP plans. So our focus for today is going to talk more thoroughly about those interventions embedded within our MTSS framework, and then some consideration questions that your team can use when you're debating or looking at student data to determine when and how we potentially need to increase that student's level of support, perhaps to one of these more formal plans. So again, we are going to look specifically at our multi-tiered framework. I'm hoping that this visual is familiar to some of you. If not, we have 2 different kind of versions up on the screen, kind of a more simple tiered system, and then we really wanted to include this more kind of comprehensive visual from NASP. We really like that one and all the detail put in it. But MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, is essentially a framework of how we're going to deliver services to students within our building or our district. It's often divided into these 3 tiers of support, where we are using benchmarking data and progress monitoring data to determine students' current strengths and areas of concern, and then appropriately match them onto the most appropriate tier of support that they may need. So we know that base tier, that green tier, is our primary prevention tier. That is things that all students are getting. That would be an example of like your social emotional learning curriculum, your positive behavior supports. It's something that we're trying to provide all students access to. And it's anticipated or hoped that approximately 80% of our student population is going to fall within this lower tier. Now, students who fall within the second tier are considered to be at risk on whatever domain or skill that you've measured, indicating that they would benefit from some level of intervention. And it's estimated or hoped that approximately 15% of our student population is going to fall within tier 2. And then finally at tier 3, that's for students whose data suggests that they're really falling at the highest risk category, meaning that at this time they're displaying significant difficulty on whatever measure or targeted skill you were looking at. And that means that they need more specialized and individualized supports to better match their needs. And it's estimated that approximately 5% of our students will fall within this top tier. So just an important note that this is kind of a base idea of what this tiered system is like. But of course, we know that there is a difference in reading about it in the research and in articles, and then actually adopting and implementing it in practice. So of course, there are likely going to be different interpretations and implementations of the MTSS framework based on whatever state, district, or school that you're in.
Excellent. And so as we think about this MTSS system, we are going to take some time to think about all the different components that are present in a typical MTSS system and how we might be able to consider this specifically for a child with selective mutism. And so certainly at the starting point, we need the identification, the screening process for how we're going to identify students that may need some additional support in the school setting. Go ahead to the next slide. Taylor, you can move to the next slide.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So for identification considerations, there are a few things that we want to think about for your schools and how you are already collecting data potentially, or if you're a school that's considering implementing more of an MTSS system, what kind of data you might want to collect. So first off, we want to think of what data does our school already have access to on students and how might that be useful? Another thing is when and how are we collecting information about students? And the biggest part here is how accurately does the data that we have identify students with anxiety disorders and selective mutism? We do know that there is some research to suggest that many of our more social emotional learning kinds of screenings are focused higher on externalizing behaviors than internalizing behaviors. And so that these internalizing behaviors can sometimes be more challenging to identify. So we'll talk about 3 different ones, and you can go to the next slide. One of those is school data. And we know that as a school, we often are collecting a number of different points of data on our students. The challenge is that many of these data points are maybe a less accurate way to represent and identify students with selective mutism. So for example, office discipline referrals, behavior write-ups, suspensions are not likely going to be things flagged for a student with selective mutism because they are typically well-behaved and functioning well in the classroom setting. In addition, things that might be maybe even more used to identify anxiety concerns like school attendance, visits to the health office, or academic performance may not always be the best representation of a student with selective mutism. So for example, a child who is less comfortable to use their words to ask to go to the health office likely isn't going to have a lot of health office visits. That doesn't mean that there aren't still functional impacts for a child in the school setting, but some of these data points may be less useful. If a child does have a formal diagnosis by an outside mental health professional or medical provider, that is a data point that we might have and might be a good data point to recognize that maybe further evaluation of the impact in the school setting is needed. Go ahead to the next slide. Another way we might be able to identify students is through teacher nomination. And there has been some research to suggest that teachers are relatively accurate in identifying students with anxiety concerns. And for SM, I think we can see that as something that would likely be a similar story. We don't always have as good of data on SM in schools, but because a teacher is the first person to likely recognize that a child isn't using their words in the classroom setting, they likely would be a good person to identify a concern. This is an example here of a teacher nomination form that might be used in a school team to identify children who may have further needs. So I just wanted to recognize if we're using something like this at our school, we might want to consider looking at the problem behaviors identified under internalizing behaviors and make sure that we're including something specifically around difficulty communicating or having a hard time communicating with teachers or peers as a way to help us identify children specifically with SM. And in addition, for any of the strategies to try, we would want to ensure that we're not only having those focused towards externalizing behaviors, but also internalizing behaviors. Go ahead. Another component that some schools will use for identification in an MTSS system is more of a universal screening model. For mental health concerns, often this is done in somewhat of a tiered approach. So we have a more universal screener, something like these general SEL screeners that can help to flag or identify risk for things like anxiety or depression. But from there, we can also look at the next steps, how we're maybe targeting more specifically through more specific screening measures for things like anxiety disorders, language and communication challenges, and then SM more specifically. And so on this slide, we just want you to recognize there are a number of screening measures that can be used, both universally and to a more targeted level. When we're thinking about screening, we wanted to just highlight that there are really two components that we want to consider. One is the usefulness of the screening measure that we're using, or measures that we're using, and as well as the preparedness of our school for following up based on the concerns identified. So usefulness, we want to make sure the tools that we're using are accurately identifying students, that we're not missing target populations that might need further support. We might want to have a further tiered system of, if someone's identified on the universal screener or is identified by a teacher, what would be the next steps in follow-up? Is it an interview with the teacher, an interview with the parents, a more specific or targeted screening to help really hone in on the concerns? And we want to also consider when and how often we're doing screening. For example, if it's in the first week of school, probably not the best time for teachers to identify concerns. And certainly for selective mutism, when we think of that first month being a time when a diagnosis might not be made, the first week is likely not the best time to do it. Under preparedness, we want to think about what are the procedures for screening, scoring, and following up on concerns that are identified through a universal model. How are we getting parental consent? What resources does our school have to support any children that are identified as needing further concerns? And what is that discussion going to look like as we talk with a child or family about the identification of a concern with SM?
Wonderful. Uh-oh, sorry guys. My video went away. There we go. Okay, so Brittany did a great job covering kind of those initial data collection steps. We're going to pause that and take a moment to talk about then tier 1 supports. So remember, what the tier 1 is what we're doing for all students. And we really just want to highlight what we're doing for all students and how we can ensure it's an appropriate fit for our students with selective mutism. So I'm going to briefly touch on considerations for our students with SM across these 5 different categories. Okay, so first and foremost, relationship building. We know how essential that is in the school setting, and educators and all school staff are really excellent at building relationships with our students. One thing I want us to consider though, at least I'll say this is true for me, and I'm guessing it might be true for you too, is that when we're trying to get to know someone or build rapport with them, we do a lot of information seeking or question asking. And, when I'm trying to get to know a student, I'm asking, what did you do over the summer? What are your favorite hobbies? Tell me about your family. So those are great get to know you questions, but consider that at the outset of an interaction with a student with SM, that might be really difficult for them to respond and engage with you. So we need to consider ways that we can build rapport while also keeping our verbal expectations really low at the outset of our relationship building. So tips for our students with SM. First and foremost, we want to be sure that we're allowing sufficient warm-up time. This means that at the outset of seeing a student, them being in your class, whether that's in the morning because you have them all day, or during your specific class period, let's say you have them 5th hour, giving them time just to adjust to the classroom and group setting might be really important. Giving them that time and space before they're ready to really kind of attempt to verbally interact with you. And it's during this warm-up time that we might want to then lean into a set of strategies called child-directed interaction skills. And that's what's highlighted in the box on your screen. And these are evidence-based strategies used within SM treatment. And these skills are pride skills, you'll see listed there, are what we use when we're trying to build rapport with a student while also keeping verbal expectations low. So we aren't asking them questions or placing verbal demands on them. So I'm not going to dive into and really operationalize these pride skills. What I'd hope is that I can point you in the direction of our SMA's educators toolkit, and that describes these pride skills a little bit more deeply. But I wanted to plant the seed that these pride skills are things you're going to use essentially at the outset of relationship building with your student. And I hope as you quickly glance at those pride skills, that brief list, you're having this reflection of, hey, I do this with many of my students anyways. I deliver specific praise. I reflect what they say to me. I join in their activities. I show genuine interest and warmth in them. So likely you're really good at all these skills anyways, but what we want to do is just make sure that we are using them really intentionally and timely for our students with SM. Next, I would recommend kind of considering your initial touch point with that student with SM or your classroom norm for greeting students. Or again, if you have them in an afternoon class period, how you're greeting them. I've seen some teachers have individualized, specialized greetings with students as they walk into the classroom. Others have like a classroom morning meeting or meeting circle time. So during these activities, we really want to account for where our student is at in terms of their comfort and ability to verbally communicate with us during this time. So if they aren't ready yet to engage the same way as other students, we just want to make small adjustments to help meet them where they're at. So for example, for many students with selective mutism, greetings tend to be difficult and a higher level goal that we work on a little bit down the road once we've tackled some easier goals. So consider if you typically greet all students by saying something like, "Hi, Josh, how are you today?" That's a really nice, kind greeting, but it might be really difficult for your student with SM to respond. So how do we still greet them and acknowledge their presence, but not do so in a way that's going to imply that they have to say something back to us? So maybe we consider an alternative welcome statement such as, "Oh, so happy you're here today," or, "Oh, I'll be excited to connect with you, Josh, after today's warm-up lesson." So letting them know that you're happy to see them, but not putting that verbal demand on them. Next, we want to make sure that we're building in consistent one-on-one time. Teachers try to do this anyways with a lot of their students, having those little personalized touch points woven in throughout their day. I think our recommendation would be just to be mindful of the setting in which you're trying to attempt to do that with your students with SM. We know group settings might be more difficult, so you might have to have those touch points during more kind of private interactions, such as, the corner of the classroom, or when it's just you two walking down the hallway to recess, something like that. And then finally, I encourage you to be flexible and creative in your relationship building. Again, if you can't ask your typical kind of get to know you questions, how else can you find out some fun facts about your students so you can start making connections about common interests and building rapport that way, such as, sending home a get to know you survey, or having a mini early conference with parents to learn about their students' interests, or consulting with last year's teacher about what they learned about the student. Next is instructional strategies. How can we ensure that our instructional and engagement approaches are appropriate, given, again, our students' current comfort level in verbalizing in the classroom? So on the left, you're going to see a brief visual of those VDI skills, and these are verbally directed interaction skills. These are evidence-based strategies used often within SM treatment, used to help promote speech with students with SM. Again, I'm going to refer you to that SMA's Educator's Toolkit for like a deeper dive into what these skills look like. But my reason for including them here is to highlight the fact that you're likely using many of these strategies with your students already during your instructional time. You're offering them specific praise when they're sharing their answers. If they get stuck or are having trouble brainstorming, you might be offering verbal scripts or ideas. If open-ended questions is feeling too hard for them, you might shrink down their choices into a multiple choice question or a forced choice question. And of course, you're allowing your students think time or wait time to provide their answers and share their responses. So again, you're probably using a lot of these strategies already. We just want to enhance them and use them very mindfully and intentionally for our students with SM while we're providing instruction. Additional things to consider when we're doing our classroom lessons is we want to be providing frequent individual check-ins to make sure the student is understanding the lesson, especially if they are at a place where it's hard for them to self-advocate and raise their hand and ask for help. And we also want to prep them, however possible, in engaging. So if they are at a place where they are working on participating in group discussions, then it might be helpful at this point to preview questions with that student before calling upon them or giving them advance notice when they'll be called on. Just like for many of our students, it might also be helpful for your students with SM to have practice responding what they'll say before having to say so in the whole group format. So consider quick like think, pair, share activities where they can practice responding in a small group setting or just with a partner before sharing within the whole group. And then finally, if you rely heavily on participation points for students' grades, we want to be really mindful of making appropriate adjustments for our students with SM if they aren't at a place yet. We're still working on it, and to contribute in a whole class format. And that again might be creative. Can we earn participation points in a one-on-one conversation with a teacher or in a small group setting with peers as opposed to the whole group setting? Next are classroom management strategies. We just really want to be mindful of how we're using these strategies and how they might impact a student's brave work in the school setting. We know that our classroom management strategies help the day run smoothly, right? They are so invaluable and important, not only for us, but also for our students. Some things that are often embedded within our classroom management strategy is the delivery of praise. We're often promoting, use specific praise, really highlight your students' strengths, areas of growth. For our students with SM, we want to be really mindful of how receptive they are to either public or private praise. We know that for many students with SM, that public praise might be very uncomfortable for them and actually might inadvertently cause them to avoid brave speaking in certain situations. So we want to tailor our praise to a way that's going to be best suited to their needs in the current moment. And that might be something like private praise, pulling them aside, delivering that praise privately during a one-on-one conversation, or using one of the many awesome apps or electronic tools that we have at our disposal these days, right? Something like Class Dojo, where you can send the student a note or their caregivers a note really highlighting something you are proud of or that they accomplished during that day. And then on the flip side of praise, we want to be really considerate of how we're delivering corrective feedback to the students in our class, whether it be academic or behavioral corrective feedback. Again, consider, do you typically do that in a public fashion or a private fashion? I would argue that many students and many adults appreciate and prefer when corrective feedback is delivered privately. And this is especially important for our students with SM who might be even more sensitive to criticism or to others noticing any perceived failure or error. So one classroom management tool that I see used quite frequently in the classroom setting is behavior clip charts. And that is an example where students' names are clipped onto a chart like the visual on your screen, and teachers guide students throughout the day to either clip up or clip down based on the behaviors that the teachers notice. Something like this I thought was a good example just to highlight for you all of potential pitfalls, one that we could have with all students in using this type of system, but particularly for our students with SM, right? So consider the scenario that the teacher had just told the class, it's silent independent work time, all voices should be at a level 0. But during this time, your student with SM worked up the courage to ask a peer a question. And you didn't hear the content of what they said, but in alignment with your classroom management strategies, you asked them to clip down. Now consider that them clipping down is probably going to make it that much harder next time to use their brave voice to ask a question to a peer. So we just want to be really, really thoughtful in our management practices. Finally, the last thing I just want to draw your attention to is how you are noticing and observing those quiet, independent work behaviors. Oftentimes we see that out of our students and we're like, yes, they're working, they're focused. That's exactly what I want them to do. But we know that for our students with SM, this actually could signal a problem. What if they are sitting there and you think that they're just thinking or working diligently, but what if they have a question? What if they're stuck? What if they don't feel well? What if they need help or are injured? Then sitting quietly is actually not the skill we want them to be practicing in that moment. Instead, we want them to be practicing self-advocacy. So I note that because sometimes with internalizing difficulties, those students sometimes fly under our radar because they appear to be following classroom expectations. So in this type of scenario, we want to be on the lookout for that and make sure that we're frequently checking in with that student to make sure that they're on target with what they need in the moment. Finally, at Tier 1, I want us to consider our classroom norms and how we can make really small tweaks or edits to help support our students with SM. So what are things that all of your students have to do day in and day out, such as attendance, selecting a classroom job, requesting to leave the classroom, turning in assignments? All those types of things might be nonverbal tasks that your students engage in throughout their day. Is there a way that we could tie verbal expectations to each of those and make it a classroom norm that everyone is practicing that and practicing those skills of self-advocacy or speech? And so it would potentially be a bonus or a good practice for all students, and then a double bonus for your student with SM who is getting to practice verbalizing in all those different ways as well. Next, we have consideration of our classroom environment. That's a really foundational component of Tier 1. Are we using things like visual schedules? Are we offering a break spot in or out of the classroom if a student needs to decompress and regulate? How does our classroom environment convey the culture and how we want our students to feel when we're there? One point I really wanted to highlight on this slide was consideration for preferential seating. This doesn't always mean that the student is going to sit in the front row right next to the teacher. Rather, they're going to have a seat assigned in a spot that works best for them. And that might be next to the teacher. That might be in the first row. It might also be in the back row or next to their most comfortable peer in that class. So be really mindful of where you're placing their student, and if possible, get their feedback either from them or from caregivers of where they're going to be most comfortable. I would say also keep in mind if a student is switching classes throughout the day, preferential seating in one class might be different than it is in another class. So that might flex based on the class environment and the composition of students within that class. And finally, we know that many classes and schools have adopted a social emotional learning curriculum or some form of mental health literacy. The purpose of this slide is just kind of highlighting things that teachers do kind of embedded with these things, these SEL curriculums, such as helping students grow greater awareness of their body feeling connection, using emotion regulation skills, validating emotional experiences. One thing I really wanted to highlight on this slide, though, is how much time and attention we're giving to common social situations and verbal scripts. I found that some of these activities we might breeze through quite quickly because we make the assumption that our student already knows this, should knows this, or has learned it through observational learning, such as how to get someone's attention or how to ask a peer to play, how to email a teacher a question. I would consider the benefit for all students, but particularly our students with SM, the benefit of really pausing and taking time on some of these lessons, talking explicitly on how to do these things, modeling for them or having their peers model what that might look like for our students with SM who are experiencing, maybe waves of anxiety all throughout their day. They be one, missing some of these opportunities to practice these skills, and two, might be missing opportunities to observe others engage in these skills if they are really just focused on regulating the anxiety themselves. So consider building these types of things into your mental health literacy curriculum as well.
Right, excellent. So thank you, Taylor. That was a wonderful overview of some of those universal things that can be happening at Tier 1 in the classroom setting. But what we're also going to focus on are maybe some more targeted intervention strategies as they relate to this more multi-tiered system of support. And so at Tier 2, again, we're thinking of this tier as a level to support students that are exhibiting risk factors, but maybe aren't showing severe concerns or severe problem behaviors. As we think about this specifically for selective mutism, those might be students who, for example, are participating at least non-verbally in class. So they will engage even if they're not using their words in all of that, in all the activities that they're doing. Also, that they maybe have at least a few individuals within the school that they do have words with. So we do know as children become more comfortable, or just for some individuals in the school setting, that they may have a few peers that they speak with or whisper with, or a few adults that they speak with or whisper with. And so this tier 2 level is likely a better fit for someone who does have some verbalization in the school setting, and certainly would be an appropriate level for a child with selective mutism who is verbally responsive in the school setting, but is maybe working on some of those higher level goals, things like self-advocacy, handling conflicts, making mistakes. And so what we are going to do is try to think about what are some of the common tier 2 interventions that exist, and how might we be able to think about modifying them to support a child with SM. Go ahead to the next slide. So here we're going to talk about a few interventions, and I do want to acknowledge this is not an exhaustive list of every tier 2 intervention. The other thing I want to acknowledge is that because of the low incidence rate of SM, there is not much research out there on tiered intervention support for children with selective mutism. So the information that we're presenting is thinking about some core common pieces of intervention that we would recommend, that we know are helpful and effective for children with SM, and trying to map that on to interventions that already exist at this tier 2 level. So we conceptualize this through two different ways. Some of them are more around rapport building and exposure practice, whereas others are around more psychoeducation or skill building practice. Some common considerations at tier 2. We know that a number of the interventions that were listed on that previous slide have some benefits. First off, many of those interventions do allow for one-on-one time or time in a small group instead of a large group setting. So we know for many of our children with selective mutism, the large group is likely the least comfortable place for them to engage and verbalize, but they might start to build their skills in a one-on-one or small group setting. So many of these allow for that opportunity outside of the large group classroom setting and in a smaller group setting. These interventions also offer repeated opportunities to build rapport with key staff or individuals in the school building. And so that repeated opportunity to build rapport allows for us to continuously build communication over time as well, and set more lengthier goals for more communication over time. We also see that these interventions allow for opportunities for exposure practice. So speaking practice, times where we can target a goal specifically where a child is at and functioning now, and work to build that over time as they gain their skill. Many of these interventions already have some built-in progress monitoring or data tracking that's happening. And there is in a number of them a focus on homeschool communication. All things that would be helpful for a child with selective mutism and things we typically are encouraging to have happen in a school setting. At the tier 2 level, there are also some challenges that come. One of the biggest challenges is recognizing that if we are trying to provide a tier 2 intervention that is not an appropriate match to where a child's current speaking functioning is, we might be putting the child at risk of engaging in that cycle of reinforcement that Taylor shared, which puts them at greater risk of having contaminated spaces in the school setting. And again, that contaminated space is really just a term used to say a place where they've established a pattern of not communicating, which is often harder to break through. So at a tier 2 level, if we have a child who's not communicating with anyone in the school setting, that tier 2 intervention where we're asking the child to communicate in certain ways might not be a good fit. In addition, we know that many of these interventions, because they're not done as maybe traditionally implemented, so for example, something like check and check out, the traditional format of check and check out may not be as appropriate for a child with SM. So we know that there are some modifications that will need to happen. And in order for those to happen, you need to have someone in the school setting, or at least a support person from the community, that can help to determine what those modifications may look like. It often is going to require that the interventionist, the mentor, the person who is engaging with the child is adjusting their communication expectations and increasing those over time. And it does require more thought about what are the specific goals that we have for this intervention, and what's the expected progress that we're hoping to see. Again, because it's less studied and researched, we have less data on exactly what progress we should expect. And we know for each child with SM, depending on severity and presentation of symptoms, the growth may look differently. As far as common modifications, we know there are some things that likely would be beneficial for a child with SM within a Tier 2 intervention. So one of those would be one-on-one or small group setting instead of in a large group or with people the child's less comfortable with. Another thing would be allowing for initial warm-up time before expecting the child to speak. So we know even in individual therapy time that opportunities to have the child feel comfortable in the space and gradually work up to those VDI skills that Taylor spoke about can be a helpful thing to build comfort communicating. And so that might be something that needs to be modified and put into our intervention time. Children with SM may need things for a longer duration and with greater frequency. So the more opportunities to practice those speaking skills more regularly and over a longer period of time is likely going to lead to better improvements. For many children, having kind of a more structured or outlined expectation of what to expect during that intervention time, or even scripting out the communication that would be expected, can sometimes feel more comfortable. Also, having opportunities to build greater expectations over time. So knowing where the child starts when we start this Tier 2 intervention, we should expect improved growth or progress with communication at the end. And lastly, we might need to consider not only how it worked in this one small group setting, but how we're going to then use our intervention time to expand communication across settings, situations, and with different people. So we're going to cover a number of Tier 2 interventions. We're not going to spend too much detail on them, but just highlighting some specific things. So with Check and Connect, this is again a common Tier 2 or potentially Tier 3 intervention in which it allows for a trusting relationship with a mentor, or in the SM world, we often call this maybe a key worker, someone that can help support intervention for the child. Check and Connect more specifically focuses on checking, so a way of monitoring student progress, as well as connecting an opportunity for intervention or practice skills. For this, the goal of this intervention is to facilitate access to and participation in school-based activities. And it's meant to be a longer-term intervention, so at least 2 years, with some homeschool communication built in. So again, lots of things as we think about those common benefits and challenges and modifications, lots of things that could be beneficial for a child with selective mutism to build that strong and lasting relationship. However, again, we do know that there are likely going to be some modifications on how we start with expectations and build that over time. But a mentor could be a wonderful person to practice some of these skills and take them not only from their office into a new setting like the lunchroom, or to the front office staff, or in the classroom, or with a small group of students, and they might help to facilitate that. Go on to the next one. Mentoring would be a similar thing. It emphasizes an opportunity for relationship building. It's a little less defined than Check and Connect, that it can occur approximately once a week for 15 minutes at a time, and the person might be a variety of different people, from an older peer to a school volunteer or staff member, but it's really about building a trusting relationship and talking about a variety of topics that the child is interested in. So again, great opportunities to practice using our words if we're taking the time to gradually build up to that as the child builds comfort with that person. It also would require likely some more specific goals or some things that we're targeting during that time. So for example, if it's a child who is speaking more regularly but struggling with some of the self-advocacy, the goal would be taking some of the time with the mentor to practice those skills. Go on to the next one. 2x10 relationship building, another intervention. This one is targeted more towards the classroom teacher, and again, focused on that rapport building about non-academic topics. So the whole concept is a 2-minute conversation that's repeated daily for 10 days, but can continue on beyond that to try to help build a relationship between the child and teacher. Again, really wonderful concept, something we advocate for in the school setting. But again, it may need to be for more than 2 minutes for a child with SM, more like 10 to 15 minutes to help them warm up and feel comfortable before speaking and talking about a subject. There might need to be more structure put in of exactly the process that that conversation will take, as well as it may have to happen for more than 10 days. It likely will need to be something that's continued on for a longer period of time. Check-in, check-out is a common Tier 2 intervention that's implemented in many different schools and districts. And again, has some really great things for a child with selective mutism, such as that opportunity to connect with a school staff member at the start of the day and at the end of the day, opportunities to connect regularly with teachers, and it allows for that self-monitoring of communication goals, and some homeschool communication. So lots of really wonderful things within it. A few things to recognize specific to check-in, check-out. One would be that we likely are going to have to change the goals that the child is working with. So the typical ones that are used, things like safe, responsible, and respectful, are likely not going to be as useful. And we might need to change it to something like brave, responsive, and participatory. Go on to the next. Lunch bunches are additionally a way to help a child connect with their peers. This is something that can be led by a school counselor or school teacher or school psychologist, and a great space to target skills as well as build comfort communicating with a variety of different people. The big thing I would recognize for this one is the goal of a lunch bunch can be very different. It should be focused on what a child's needs are. So if their need is to increase the number of peers that they speak with in the school, then cycling in new people into the lunch bunch activity time where there are specific talking rules and expectations would be one thing. If it's to work on self-advocacy, then we'd want to have activities built into the lunch bunch that can focus on that. And certainly we can also see this be done through something more like an individualized counseling session with a school psychologist, counselor, social worker, who would be able to support providing some education around anxiety, developing coping tools, and then opportunities to practice building communication. Then we also have these ones that are more around skill building groups or psychoeducation. Again, I want to recognize these don't necessarily target the goal of increasing communication, but they do allow children maybe an opportunity to build some skills or learn some information that they're less familiar with that can help them feel braver, stronger, and more comfortable engaging. And so that can be another option to consider. Social skills falls in the same. I think for time's sake, we'll jump past that. At the Tier 3 level, just recognizing this is a more intensive support for students that have greater needs. And so this is likely going to be for a child who maybe is participating non-verbally again in the classroom and has at least one person in the school that they've built communication with. If we are at the level where there's no one yet built in the school, that might be a more intensive support or a different kind of support that's not necessarily appropriate for an MTSS system. But this tier 3 would be about how we can try to help to expand communication beyond the one person to others. And so often, if you go to the next slide, using something like an FBA and behavior plan can be a helpful approach for, again, gathering more specific data about the child's current communications across various settings with different people, so that we can really know more about the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences of the child in the school setting, of their communication in the school setting. But in addition to that, our plan can be more comprehensive, to think more about the accommodations that can help them feel more comfortable in the classroom setting, about the intervention goals that we have for them, and how we can reinforce that process and monitor it over time. Go ahead to the next. And so progress monitoring becomes another major portion of our MTSS system. And so I wanted to highlight a number of progress monitoring tools. These can be intervention-specific tracking tools that are likely about a specific goal that you have and monitoring how the child improves with that specific goal. Or they can be broader around communication skills more generally. Go ahead to the next. So we're going to flip through these quickly just for timing's sake. Intervention-specific ones, you could have something like the number of utterances. And again, these are examples at younger and older ages. These are the check in, check out ones. But again, we'd want to change the goals. Behavior report cards are another approach that we can use. This is from Intervention Central. You can target the goals to whatever you want, and you can do ratings. So for example, if our goal is increasing engagement with the teacher in the classroom setting, I chose 3 different goals that we're tracking here. Nonverbal engagement, answering questions from the teacher, and spontaneously sharing with the teacher. And we can track that over time. This is, again, more of an intervention specific around answering questions from teachers and peers, where we can have it as more visual for younger kiddos or more text heavy for older kiddos. Goal attainment scales can be a wonderful way to measure progress over time. Now, certainly, they're a bit more subjective in that it's a teacher's perception of the percentage of time that a child, in this case, was answering questions verbally from staff and peers. But we can, over time, get a sense of growth and progress. This is the voice coding system. This is developed by Florida International University's MINT program, and it allows us to think about a target set of questions that we're asking, maybe repeatedly over time, and how much we need to prompt the child to provide a response, the way that they responded from nonverbal to verbal, and how frequently they are and consistently they're responding. So those are, again, more specifically to a goal, whereas these communication tracking systems are looking at the child's communication more broadly. So talking maps, for example, the one in the middle here would be actually drawing out a map of the school and thinking about the child's current comfort communicating in different settings, with green being really comfortable and verbal, yellow being working on it, and red being not yet comfortable. This talking map on the side is more specific people in the child's life on one end, and the situations or settings where they would be involved, and being able to identify the current places where they speak and track that over time as they have more progress and growth. These are, again, ones on specific skills. So the one on the left focuses more specifically on communication skills that we would hope a child has, and trying to determine if they're present, developing, or consistently happening. That one you might need to do across various people or settings or situations, but it gives us some good data about what that communication looks like. And similarly, this one is thinking of the continuum of communication from nonverbal to spontaneous speech and thinking about it across different individuals in the school setting. And lastly, this is a pragmatic checklist, various pragmatic skills we expect older students to have, and thinking about for individuals, peers, or adults, how regularly the child is doing these things. All of these tracking tools can be helpful for monitoring progress over time and determining growth as we put these interventions in place. A few things to just briefly consider: the time to complete the progress monitoring tool. We want it short. We want to get as accurate data as possible. And we want to make sure that we are sharing this information and using this intervention to modify or change the intervention to increase it over time.
We're going to skip these for time's sake. That's just kind of summary of things we already touched on, but kind of just ending on guiding questions you or your team might consider when asking that question: is the current level of intervention within the MTSS framework appropriate for my student, or do we need to consider a different level of support? So we want to, of course, be looking at intervention effectiveness. Can they be continued and maintained over time? Do we have the adequate resources and staffing at this level of the tier to continue on? Can they be consistently provided and monitored with fidelity at the current tier? Or in actuality, are we providing a higher degree of service, but still calling it tier 2, when really maybe we need to look at everything we might be doing for a student and resituate it to its most appropriate tier, whether that's within the tier system or looking beyond to those more formalized plans such as the 504 or IEP. And of course, we want to be considering student growth. Is it happening across all settings and situations within the school? Is the current intervention level supporting a good rate of growth? And then based on that growth, continuing to always monitoring the functional impairments that the student might be experiencing given continued difficulties. We know a student could be making really great strides and progress in their brave or courageous speaking at school, but if the functional impact is still as such that it's very significant, we still then might need to consider whether they need a higher level of support or one of those more formal plans. We were not kidding. We jam-packed this. So we, of course, you guys will have access to the slides. Following this, we'll send it out so you can reference, because we loaded them with a lot of detail as well. But this is going to bring us to the end of it. And I know we're the teeniest bit over, but if anyone wants to hang out and ask any questions, we're more than happy to do so as well.
Another thing I just wanted to mention as well, there are a number of school-focused webinars that exist from the Selective Mutism Association. So I know a lot of questions were about how to actually put some of these interventions in place. That wasn't the full focus of this meeting, but there are some really wonderful webinars that cover some of that information. And so I encourage you to take a look there at some of those resources.
And I know we mentioned the conference that's coming up in October, which is really exciting for those of you who are interested or able to attend. So again, that's a virtual conference, October 6th and 7th. So that would be a great resource. Brittany mentioned some other videos on the SMA YouTube page, as well as just our, written print resources on the SMA website. And then another fun thing that MSA will be launching quite soon is a self-paced educators web course that goes into a bit more detail, specific intervention approaches that we can use to support our students with SM in the school setting. So be looking for that on the educators page on the SMA website as well. Meg or Brittany, did any specific questions pop up? I'm sorry, I can't see the Q&A.
Yeah, I think one was asking about our opinion on talking with a class about a child with selective mutism. I think that's certainly an appropriate thing to do. I always just recommend that if a teacher is considering doing that they first speak with the family and have kind of feedback from the family that they're open to that.
Yeah, I would say that parent or guardian consent and of course child assent in doing that, and figuring out some of the logistics about whether the child wants to be part of that discussion or present at it and what that might look like, as well as I would encourage educators to think through kind of the next steps, right? Like what happens after if students have questions, or then are directing questions or comments to the student with SM. So have kind of a really thoughtful implementation plan if you're going to do that approach.
Absolutely. There was another one about advice or resources on anxieties around independent washrooming for SM students. I was just going to mention there's a webinar specifically on toileting and feeding for students with SM. So I would recommend taking a look at that for more detailed information. Someone asked about a recommendation for working with outside providers to help support a child with SM. Taylor, do you want to take that one?
Yes, I would say if you have the opportunity to do so, I mean, I'm always all for collaboration. If you think back, I know we went through it rather quickly, but even that visual of the MTSS framework, the one that NASP put together, that was a bit more comprehensive. It really highlights within the tiers when to be collaborating with other key stakeholders and resources within your community. Having worked both within the school setting and now consulting with schools from an outside position, I just have to say it's so valuable from both parties, both perspectives, for that collaboration, to learn from one another, to share information about goal setting. Goals likely are going to look different what the students working on in the community or within their family setting versus school, but they also might work really similar. So if we can have some, consistency about what works or what reinforcement systems we're using and keep that consistent, that might be really beneficial as well. So I would say, again, per parent consent, I always advocate for whatever collaboration, tag whoever could be part of your team into this process.
There was also a great question about seeing significant regression for students with SM during transitions. For example, a toddler that's diagnosed receives intervention, begins speaking in the preschool program, but then transitions into the elementary school in kindergarten. Would a child revert back to their initial baseline is the question.
I think that's such a good question. I think, it's always so individual specific, right? We can't make solid predictions about that, but I would say that, with big transitions, when we're changing the setting in which we're going to be in, the communication partners that we'll have access to, and potentially the different tasks, we might be at risk for our comfort or anxiety changing within those moments. So I would say, prevention is always key. That's a big hallmark of the MTSS framework, right? Like, what preventative steps can we take to help aid that student's transition? That might be something like, can you kick off relationship building for the next year's teacher before the previous year has even ended? Can you do those individual meet and greets and fade-ins and relationship building? Provide next year's team and teachers with whatever resources they need on your individual student, as well as the SM strategies, support strategies that have worked for you. And again, kind of thinking back to those tier one, during transitions, not only year to year, but coming back from holiday breaks, those are the times you're going to lean into where you really want to be thoughtful about giving more warm-up time, right? Coming back from Christmas break, let's say you had great, comfortable, established speech right before the holiday break, but then that student all those days didn't practice speaking with you or even going to school. So they might need unexpectedly warm-up time transitioning back after the new year. So maybe don't hit them right away with, hi, Johnny, tell me all about your break. Lean into some of those CDI strategies first, those pride skills, reestablish rapport and comfort, and then go back to using your good toolkit for verbally engaging with your student. Those are oftentimes too, that let's say we kind of faded or thinned out a reinforcement system as part of, let's say, that tier 3 kind of behavior intervention plan. We're reinforcing brave speaking at school. Let's say we thinned that out quite a bit because the student has grown speech quite well. At big transitions, big breaks, that might be times where we're more thoughtful about more consistent, positively reinforcing that brave speaking as we're, again, getting back into that cycle of approach upon the return to school.
There's another question about, there are some who believe that intervention in schools may exacerbate SM, focusing more on educating the classroom teacher. What are your thoughts about this hypothesis? And so I would certainly say if we are not providing intervention at the right level, we may be reinforcing a lack of communication. But if we are appropriately setting up a gradual exposure approach to increase the number of people and settings and situations where a child's communicating, I think we would all say intervention is the only way to make growth and change. And if we just wait and see, that's typically how we're going to continue to see this occur year to year, and get to middle school and have a kiddo who hasn't yet used their words with someone. There also was a question about my daughter has selective mutism. She's doing well with whispering to the teacher responses, but what would be a reasonable next goal for her to reach?
Such a good question. Again, that's like a snippet of information, and I don't want to jump in and give an idea that maybe you've already tried or without not knowing the whole picture, but just knowing that there are so many different ways we can adjust and expand our goals, right? So if we're at a really quiet level, is the next step to working on increasing volume? That is one path forward, trying to increase volume with maybe our most comfortable speaking partners first in the school setting, focusing on that. Or are we working on increasing sentence length or the number of people or settings that we're speaking in? So it can take a variety of different paths, but I think that is where good collaboration between families, school staff, and outside providers is really key, to kind of put your heads together in those moments to talk about, okay, this is what the student's doing in this setting. What would be that next step goal if we've got consistent whispering at school? Is it the next step that we're increasing volume then? And with who and how?
There's also one about a student in high school who uses avoidance behaviors. She's quite capable of doing the classwork, but won't enter the classroom. Do you have suggestions for this student? I think this is one, again, where if we think about our anxiety wall, what that child is sending a message of is that the classroom setting is a very uncomfortable place to be at this moment. And so I think what our goal would be is how can we join together with her to help her gradually reintroduce into the classroom, to be more participatory and a part of the classroom and to feel comfortable there. That's not an easy fix, and likely will take a decent amount of time. But again, I think if we expect her to just go back in the classroom without providing some support to get there, we'll likely see kind of that avoidance continue to happen.
And thank you so much for sharing that about your situation. I'm sorry she's going through that. One thing I love that this highlights for us, right, is that a lot of times it's the adults putting our heads together and trying to figure out a plan. But I think Brittany's response really highlighted to the value of student insight and collaboration. No, they might not be part of all of our conversations or be sitting around our, MTSS roundtable talking about student data and what tier they should be in. But student voice and student perspective should be taken into account throughout this whole process, particularly in setting our hierarchy or our goal ladder, right? We need to know what's going to feel most difficult for the student, what's going to feel kind of a medium level difficulty, and what's going to feel easiest. And they are going to guide us in kind of shaping that exposure ladder. And possibly even guiding, with who they're going to feel most comfortable in the school setting, practicing some of these challenging things with.
maybe one more question and then we'll end our time. I so appreciate how everyone has been so engaged in asking such wonderful questions. The last one that I was going to pull here, when teaching in a small group reading setting with a child with selective mutism, do you recommend verbal encouragement, or can that be harmful? She seems very comfortable, smiling, and wanted to give hugs during greeting time in the classroom, etc.
I think that really speaks first and foremost to the great nonverbal rapport you've built with her. Her body is telling you that she's really excited to see you and feels that safety with you. I think thinking to that relationship building, right? So we've gotten to the step of where you've probably built a good rapport non-verbally with her. Then shifting to how can you potentially establish speech? That's what I'm hearing, and probably the sole focus, right? Like in order to help her practice her reading, we're going to need to get some speech. But I would consider, even thinking about all those tier 2 interventions, right, that are in kind of, a lot of them are in a small group format, which can be great. But for some of our students, even that small group setting might be too difficult at this point. Not that they'll never get there, but at the outset, it might need to be more of a one-on-one situation with ample warm-up time, and then using those VDI strategies that I kind of highlighted on the slide that I want you to go to the educator's toolkit to look deeper at, to establish comfortable speech with you and her before trying to fade that back into kind of your instructional approaches in that small reading group format. Anything else, Brittany?
And I was even thinking of, having some more targeted or scripted expectations for that time too might be helpful. So if it's around reading, maybe you read a story together or you read it to her, and then it's a specific question, maybe starting very concretely with something like, was the animal in the story a zebra or an elephant, where we can build in a forced choice question to help the child maybe feel more comfortable responding. All right. Oh my goodness, you have so many wonderful questions, and we're so sorry that we weren't able to get to all of them. I know there were questions about the materials we'll send out. Certainly those will be coming out in the link that you receive. And so thank you very much for all of your time today, all the amazing work you're doing in your schools. And I hope that this was helpful for considering how we might be able to build in some additional supports in the school setting for children with selective mutism.
Thank you all for your time. Have a wonderful night and a great school year.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Taylor and Brittany.